too. So we've been covering a couple of episodes of this TMZ special that they put on Tubi. If you guys want to check it out, I'll leave a link in the description for you to watch the full version of this. But we're actually going to get into a couple of back and forths between some of the legal experts here. You know, we got Ebony K. Williams, my guy Joe Tacopina, and we're going to hear from Nancy Grace later on as well. But check out what they have to say here about this verdict from the jury on the Sean Diddy Combs trial. Here we go. And y'all let me know what you think about this in the comments in the chat too.
A stunning loss for Diddy prosecutors.
Oh, I need to fix this.
Despite being convicted of 2 felonies, Diddy dodged the most serious charges. The jury convicted Diddy for transporting sex workers across state lines. But the case never would have been filed if it was only about that. Fact is, prosecutors lost, and lost big. Not proving sex trafficking against Cassie. Not proving sex trafficking against Jane. Not proving the biggest charge of them all, racketeering. A unanimous jury came back quickly and hard. What happened? We have answers.
So those jurors who gave 6 weeks of their lives watched every second of evidence. You didn't even sit there for 1 minute of evidence. So don't tell me that the juries are screwed up.
Let's go, Joe.
This is United States versus Sean Combs inside the Diddy trial.
Dang. This
There
is
is
be good.
no other way of looking at this. This was an enormous, spectacular loss for prosecutors. They would never have filed this case if it were just a Mann Act case of transporting sex workers. They filed this case because they wanted to get Diddy on sex trafficking and get him on racketeering, and they failed in spectacular fashion. So we're going to get into it right now. Joining us, Charles Latiboudiere, who is the executive producer of TMZ. Joe Tacopina, a defense lawyer who recently won the ASAP Rocky case and
shout out to ASAP Joe.
This outcome. Ebony K. Williams, host of Equal Justice and Holding Court, and Ashley Banfield, host of Banfield on News Nation, also the host of the Drop Dead Serious podcast.
Shout out to Ashley.
Does anybody want to disagree with me that this was a seismic loss for prosecutors here?
I couldn't disagree.
Yeah. Pretty embarrassing, right?
Very embarrassing.
Byline, though, I disagree with your byline, Harvey. Stunning verdict. There's nothing stunning about it. It's what the verdict was going to be all along. I called it. And I'm not saying because I'm patting myself on the back, but it was because that's what the evidence in this case was. This was the most expensive prostitution trial in the history of American jurisprudence. Period. End of story. There was not a racketeering case. It never was a racketeering case. You need to prove an enterprise. Sex trafficking is even more of a joke because in sex trafficking, the standard is so high for force and coercion. And the evidence in this case was so crystal clear that there was doubts. Remember, it's a reasonable doubt about force and coercion, especially when there's evidence of consent. So I don't think there's anything stunning about the verdict.
Tons of consent.
You know, it was a big news, but that's the verdict that I told you was going to be all along. The Mann Act is, you know, look, I don't think anyone's ever been prosecuted for the Mann Act.
That's true,
but,
Brock.
But that being said, factually, he was guilty of that.
You know, Ashley, I gotta say, I know you are stunned by this verdict. Joe does have a point that whether we're stunned or not, this jury seemed to come together with lightning speed. That an hour in, it seemed like there was only one holdout. So they weren't buying what the prosecution was selling.
No, but I'm still kind of I'm flummoxed because one of the first questions that came out looked like they were finding a predicate act to racketeering, which was, hey, if somebody asks for drugs and the defendant gives the drugs, is that distribution? And it is. And they were given clear law to show that it is. So it looked as though, well, we've got a drug distribution. We've checked off yes to that predicate act for racketeering. And then before that, you had, let's just skip arson. I never liked that one anyway, but you had
the arson was
instances
BS.
of kidnapping. You had multiple instances of bribery.
No,
you
you
had
didn't.
multiple instances of assault.
Nope.
it just felt so strange that you only had to pick two, and there was ample witness testimony and corroborating witness testimony and evidence to show that these things had happened. And I disagree with Joe. You do not need to have a John Gotti corporation in order to carry out, a business that exists for crime. You can have just a group of people who go out on the golf course and agree that they're going to do something.
Where's the group?
Thank you, Harvey. That's exactly what I was going to say. Where's the group? You know where they are? It was all the witnesses except for law enforcement that got immunity and were allowed to testify without repercussion. So if you really care, guys, you want to get him on RICO, there was an enterprise. Why isn't Cassie on the stand? Why isn't Cassie on the stand? Why'd you give immunity to the one bodyguard that wanted to testify? Where's the group? Where are they at? You said there was evidence. What? How?
Where's the group? There's one guy who was prosecuted.
They named them, and
there were no co-conspirators.
I've never seen a RICO prosecution with one guy.
Never.
Racketeering organization.
Joe, you know as well as I do. You know as well as I do. You do not have to have the co-conspirators up on the stand, and they were clear.
There was no co-conspirators.
They did not need to. They learned who they were. They learned the names all the way along. They learned the D-Rock. They learned the KKs. They learned the assistants. They learned all of their names and what they did.
The jurors sat there for 6 weeks. They listened to the testimony. You did it.
The co-conspirators had to be given immunity. They were given immunity right there in the courtroom.
Right.
That's terrible.
And the prosecutors were clear in the jury instructions. You do not need to see these co-conspirators. Your job is to do your job. You let us do ours. You don't have to have the co-conspirators in front of you. They were told that.
It's like, hey guys, there's these imaginary people. There's these imaginary people out there that help Diddy do all these things. Don't worry about them. Let's just focus on Diddy, right? Don't worry about these other people. We're not going to mention them. But Diddy, look at all this he was doing. It's crazy, right? Get out of here.
They learned the KKs. They learned the assistants. They learned all of their names and what they did.
The jurors sat there for 6 weeks. They listened to the testimony. You did it.
The co-conspirators had to be given immunity. They were given immunity right there in the courtroom.
Right.
And the prosecutors were clear in the jury instructions. You do not need to see these co-conspirators. Your job is to do your job. You let us do ours. You don't have to have the co-conspirators in front of you. They were told that.
Ashley, 12.
You know my favorite thing about Joe, and then I'll let it play. Joe understands and gets juries, and you can see that through the success that he's had. He understands the common people like me, you and me. Joe is so smart that he can understand this is what the jury is thinking. This is what they're seeing. This is how they're going to perceive this. Because as you've heard him say here, the jury looked at this and said, where are the other people? Where's the and where's the enterprise? Did Diddy actually set this up to participate in these type of activities? No. The jury didn't see it.
12 people from the community. 12 people from the community said you're wrong.
Diddy's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, spoke outside the courthouse after the verdict, and he views this as a win.
Today's a great victory. It's a great victory for Sean Combs. It's a great victory for the jury system. You saw that the Southern District of New York prosecutors came at him with all that they had. They're not stopping, but one thing stands between all of us and a prison, and that is a jury of 12 citizens.
So the jury...
Oh, we got an ad. Sorry, guys. Unfortunately, you can't turn the ads off on this, and I should have saved my speech for this point. But I agree. It was a win here. And it absolutely was a win, because the entire reason they brought this case is to show that Diddy just had all these people and all these moving pieces and was preying on people and set this up for people to do this and brought people here. And that wasn't the case. And your case falls apart if you take away so many of the pieces that are meant to build your case, that you're meaning to build your case on. So if you take away all of this, you take away Cassie, you take away the bodyguard, and they're essentially up there snitching, let's be real, and trying to look like victims. Oh, I'm a victim. It's not going to work. And it didn't.
And, you know, prosecutors showed some of it. But when you are showing Cassie or Jane having sex in a room where there's no apparent do it or else, that may have backfired.
I can't wait to
for
hear
them.
this from
And
Ebony.
maybe it was the strongest evidence for the defense.
So
You were
here's
wrong,
my overall
Ebony.
take, Harvey. I agree that this verdict isn't stunning, but not because of what Joe is saying, not because the evidence was not presented or available. I simply think the prosecution put out too broad of a case. I think there were too many witnesses. I think 34 was ridiculous. I think so many of those witnesses, a la Don Rashad and many
They were
others,
just bad
could have
witnesses.
they were awash and they didn't do any favors to the prosecution.
They hurt the prosecution.
I think, let me say this, I think, exactly. I also agree with you, Harvey. I think that many of those freak-off videos were not helpful to the prosecution and muddied the water in favor of the defense. I don't think this was because they didn't have a good case. The prosecution of the federal government of the United States of America doesn't bring these type of charges when they don't have the evidence. I think the way the evidence was presented, I think the order of witnesses, I think the surplus of witnesses, they were asking this jury, Harvey, to do too much. They were asking.
How do you say there's trafficking and there's force and there's coercion and not show the freak off? What do you just say? Hey guys, just take our word for it? No, you have to show them evidence that there was coercion, there was force, and then you show the freak off videos. And as the defense said, and as we've heard from Clayton Howard, take Clayton Howard for whatever you will. And he's like, no, Cassie was enjoying it. They were all enjoying it. And many times they asked for it. I met this one chick, Diddy says, the defense team says, and that's what she wanted. That's why she was with Diddy. It's because she's like, yeah, let's do them freak offs.
Asking them to take so much information, so many accounts, so many pieces of evidence in, and then asking them to reach the very high burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that was the strategic legal mistake of this prosecution. So in that way, I agree with Joe. It's not a stunning verdict to me either. I said a week ago on a different broadcast. I think they're asking too much of this jury, but I think that the evidence was there. It was poorly presented.
You know, Charles, our office, which was it was insane today. I think that this bail denial, where Diddy is now going to sit for 3 months,
it's so stupid.
Was truly stunning because it just felt like, hey, it's a nonviolent crime he was convicted of. They're going to let him out.
I'm sure that Diddy's attorneys felt like they had this thing all wrapped up, right? Because they did have a huge victory today. To only get the Mann Act charges, conviction on the Mann Act charges, there's no way that Mark Agnifilo and Tenny Garagos cannot look at that as anything but a victory. And so they probably thought, yeah, the judge is going to agree with us. Obviously, he's been in for all this time, and those crimes, the Mann Act, are not inherently violent. He's not harming anybody in society. And so they probably felt like, yeah, the judge is going to let him out on bail. But the judge did the exact opposite, came in there and not only denied him bail, but said it's because he is a violent man. And we have seen evidence of this. The judge, at least, was swayed by all that testimony about his violence. That clearly the jurors were not, where he referenced.
I'm sorry, Joe. Let me just interrupt for a second. He was a violent man. He was proven to be a violent man. He was proven to be a batterer. But that's not what he was charged with. So the jurors didn't have to.
No, I agree, Joe. But that's why I agree that's why the jury.
And we talked about this when we were trying to find out more information on why the judge made this decision. Just because he wasn't convicted of that, he wasn't convicted and charged with DV, or he wasn't convicted and charged with the battery, doesn't mean the judge can't take that into factor with the sentencing and also when it comes to bond. I wish I could remember the term. Again, I'm not an attorney. Y'all let me know and remind me in the comments and in the chat, though.
I get you on that. But the point is, the judge obviously made a big deal about that and said that that's why I'm keeping him behind bars until sentencing. So it made a difference for the judge. And clearly he felt like there was some danger in letting Diddy out for these next 3 months.
And by the way, that does not bode well for Diddy and his sentencing.
Right.
Federal sentencing guidelines apply. But if this judge made a finding, he just did, that he's a violent man, again, no stretch there. it means he's really taking his conduct, related conduct, very seriously.
Can the judge
I agree.
look at somebody's character, somebody's history in sentencing for a particular crime that doesn't necessarily relate to that?
Depends on the case.
The answer is yes, Harvey. Yes. Wait 1 second, Joe. Joe, 1 second. 1 second. In the sense that it can be an aggravating factor, right? That the defendant, while not convicted of particular crimes that carry particular sentences, if the prosecution wants to make an overall argument, which they are, I'm sure they will, that he is generally inherently a threat to public safety. He is inherently and generally a violent, threatening individual. I think that will go a long way in the sentencing as an aggravating factor. Go ahead, Joe.
But all I was going to say, it has to, Harvey, to answer your question. It can't just be bad conduct from 5 years ago or 20 years or somewhere else. It has to be related.
The Intercontinental.
That's exactly Joe. The examples that the judge gave were just a year ago. He said in June of 2024.
They are. No, I'm agreeing, Charles, that they are related. They are related to this case. That was the evidence, right? Even if he was acquitted, the judge could still find related conduct. And he could use that in assessing the guidelines. And
as an aggravated
I think we're all saying the same thing, that this is a bad sign for Diddy and what's going to happen in sentencing in October.
Yeah, wait, hold on. Ashley, 1 second, and then I'll let you go. I'm sorry. But a bad sign in this regard, he may get more time than he was hoping to get because, people are talking about, his guideline range. I calculated it. I have it about 5 years.
So Joe's saying 5. I said 10.
He's done already almost 1. He's going to get 85% off. We're talking about a couple of years in the clink, and he goes home. Big difference than what he was looking at a few days ago, right? Mm-hmm. But if the judge ratchets that up a little bit because of the aggravating circumstance, aggravated conduct, related conduct, he can do more.
Mm-hmm. Joe, I've covered so many cases where I've watched prosecutors submit their wish list for, the Pong game between the sentencing guidelines. And I've seen the prosecutors and the defense both submit their wish list. And I've watched judges go above and beyond even what the prosecutors have asked for, because the judges have watched the entire case.
So in this
they
case,
are given the discretion. It is why we call them Your Honor, and they sit higher above than the rest of us in the courtroom. And I could see this one. With the abhorrent behaviors are related to this case that were asserted in this courtroom. I could see Judge Aaron Subramanian saying, it is my discretion, and I am going to sentence at the top of the guidelines, and I am going to sentence consecutively, because these are...
Oh my gosh, get out of here. I don't want to hear this BS. Let me know what y'all think about this. Diddy is not, I'll put something on it. Diddy is not getting 20 years. That would be absolutely insane. He's not going to get 20 years. Joe is he said he already looked at the judge's track record and he's estimating about 5. Ashley here is saying 20. What? It's 20 years back to back. She doesn't know what she's talking about. I'm going to go right in the middle and I'm going to say 10. I think Diddy's going to get 10. Maybe some of them he'll be able to do on probation. That's how I'm feeling. And he'll end up actually serving maybe 2 or 3 years. We'll have to wait and see. Y'all let me know what you think about this in the comments and in the chat.